The skies of the Second World War belonged to men, or so the world believed. But as war spread across continents and America faced the limits of manpower, a new kind of courage took flight. They were not soldiers. They did not carry guns. They wore no uniforms of rank. Yet they flew America's warplanes, bombers, fighters, and transports, and helped change the course of aviation history. They were the Women Airforce Service Pilots, the WASP. Before America entered World War II, flying was still a rare and glamorous pursuit. Airlines were few, and pilots were national heroes, barnstormers, stunt flyers, pioneers. For women, the cockpit was almost completely closed. In 1940, fewer than 1,000 women in the United States held pilot licenses. They faced ridicule, doubt, and exclusion. But the coming war would change everything. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. found itself in desperate need of pilots. Thousands of men were required overseas to fight in Europe and the Pacific, leaving too few to handle the growing demands at home. Across the country, factories were producing aircraft faster than they could be delivered. Planes needed ferrying, testing, and training flights, and there weren't enough pilots left to fly them. For two women, both pilots and visionaries, this shortage looked like an opportunity. Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Harkness Love were among the most accomplished aviators in America. Cochran was ambitious and outspoken, a record-breaking flyer who had risen from poverty to fame through skill and sheer determination. Love was calm, precise, and deeply respected within military aviation circles. In 1942, both approached the U.S. Army Air Forces with the same bold idea: let women fly military aircraft inside the United States, freeing male pilots for combat. The proposal met skepticism and even ridicule. Generals dismissed it as risky and unnecessary. But as the war intensified, the military's desperation for pilots forced a change of mind. By September 1942, 2 women's flying programs were approved. Nancy Love led the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, known as the WAFS. Jacqueline Cochran led the Women's Flying Training Detachment, the WFTED. The 2 programs had different beginnings but shared the same goal: to prove that women could serve their country in the air. In August 1943, they merged into a single unit, the Women Airforce Service Pilots, the WASP. Cochran became its director. Love continued to lead the ferrying operations. Training took place at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas. Women from across America, teachers, secretaries, nurses, and students, arrived with a dream and a pilot's license. They were young, most in their early 20s. Each needed at least 35 hours of flight experience just to apply. Out of more than 25,000 applicants, fewer than 2,000 were accepted. Only a little over 1,000 graduated. Their training matched that of male cadets. They studied navigation, meteorology, flight rules, and aircraft mechanics. They learned to fly the PT-17 Stearman, the AT-6 Texan, and the BT-13 Valiant, the same trainers used by combat pilots. It was exhausting and dangerous. Several women died during training, but those who earned their silver wings did so with pride and purpose. After graduation, the WASPs were assigned to bases across the United States. Though they lived under military command, they were classified as civilians. Their jobs were diverse: ferrying aircraft from factories to airfields, towing aerial targets for live-fire training, testing repaired planes, and transporting cargo or personnel. They flew nearly every aircraft in the Army Air Forces, from light trainers to heavy bombers. "We flew everything the men didn't have time to fly," one woman said, "and sometimes the planes they didn't want to fly." Imagine a young woman in her 20s climbing into a gleaming P-51 Mustang. She checks her instruments, tightens her seatbelt, and takes off alone. Her mission: ferry the fighter from a California factory to an airbase in Kansas. No GPS, no radar, no pressurized cabin, just maps, skill, and courage. These flights were thrilling and deadly. The women faced mechanical failures, storms, and prejudice. If they crashed, there were no military honors, no benefits for their families. Yet they flew, not for glory, but for duty and the love of flying. Their competence faced constant doubt. Many male officers resented their presence. Ground crews sometimes refused to believe that a woman had flown in the aircraft she delivered. "Where's the pilot?" one mechanic asked. "You're looking at her," the WASP replied. Over time, their professionalism spoke louder than bias. Commanders began to trust them. Mechanics learned to respect them. Even combat pilots recognized that every woman who ferried an aircraft freed one more man to fight overseas. By 1944, WASPs were flying almost every aircraft in the U.S. inventory. The B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, and even the mighty B-29 Superfortress. They ferried more than 12,000 planes, logging over 60 million miles in service. Without them, America's wartime production would have stalled. But they remained civilians, denied the pay, benefits, and honors of military personnel. 38 died in service, in training crashes, ferrying missions, and test flights. When one was killed, there was no flag on the coffin, no government compensation. Her comrades took up a collection to send her home. At Avenger Field, a plane would fly overhead, dropping a white flower in her memory. By late 1944, with the war turning in the Allies' favor, thousands of male pilots were returning home. Some military leaders claimed the women were no longer needed. Under political pressure, the program was quietly disbanded on December 20th, 1944. There was no farewell ceremony, no national acknowledgment. The women packed their flight suits, turned in their wings, and went home. Their service, it seemed, had ended not with applause, but silence. Back in civilian life, the transition was jarring. They had risked their lives flying military aircraft, but they were denied veteran status. There were no pensions, no medical care, no acknowledgement. When they applied for commercial aviation jobs, they were told bluntly, "We don't hire women pilots." The newspapers that had once featured them with smiling headlines now ignored them. And when they were mentioned, it was often with condescension, the girls who flew planes for fun. Few knew they had piloted bombers, fighters, and experimental aircraft under combat-like conditions. Jacqueline Cochran tried to preserve the program's reputation. She and General Hap Arnold had fought to make the WASP part of the Army Air Forces, but Congress refused. The proposal failed, derailed by bureaucracy and public pressure to give men returning from the front their jobs back. Arnold, however, told the women before they left, "You have shown that you can fly wingtip to wingtip with your brothers. If ever there is a need again, you will be the first women to fly for your country." The years that followed were quiet. The records of the WASPs were sealed and classified for decades. Their existence faded from public memory. Few Americans knew that women had flown for the military during the war at all. Yet among themselves, the WASP stayed connected. They held reunions, exchanged letters, and kept their flight logs, tangible reminders of what they had achieved. One pilot, Florine Watson, kept hers by her bedside for 40 years. Each entry, B-17 training flight, ferry mission, test hop, was a personal monument to a forgotten victory. By the 1970s, a new generation began asking questions. Women were entering the military in greater numbers, and history rediscovered the WASPs. As the Air Force announced its first class of female pilots in 1976, the surviving WASPs were stunned. They had done it decades earlier and been forgotten. They organized, wrote letters, and lobbied Congress for official recognition. Women like Deanie Parrish and Bee Haydu became leaders of the movement. They gathered records and testimonies proving that they had served under military command and risked their lives for their country. After 3 years of effort, in 1977, Congress passed a bill granting the WASPs full veteran status. President Jimmy Carter signed it into law. At last, They were officially recognized as military personnel. The government acknowledged that they had rendered valuable service during a time of war. For the surviving women, it was not about money or medals. It was about honor. After more than 3 decades, the country had finally said, "You were one of us." By then, many had already passed away. Of the 1,074 who had earned their wings, only a few hundred lived to see their recognition. At Avenger Field, a memorial was built in their honor. Every year, on clear Texas mornings, the survivors gathered there to remember those who never made it home. As jets roared overhead, they stood silently, remembering the days when the sound of propellers filled these same skies. The 1980s brought new respect. The Air Force began to teach their story. Female cadets learned about the WASPs as the first generation of women to fly for the U.S. military. The old photos of smiling young pilots beside their aircraft became symbols of determination. By the 1990s, women were flying fighters, transports, and helicopters in the U.S. Air Force. Their achievements rested on the foundation built by the WASPs. Many modern aviators called them heroes. When Jeannie Leavitt became the first female fighter pilot, she said she owed her dream to the women who had come before. The 2000s brought one final recognition. The WASPs were granted burial rights at Arlington National Cemetery. Women who had once been denied even military funerals were now laid to rest with full honors. As jets passed overhead, younger pilots saluted, knowing they stood on the shoulders of giants. And then, in 2010, came the greatest honor of all, the Congressional Gold Medal. Nearly 300 surviving WASPs gathered in the U.S. Capitol. Many arrived in wheelchairs, their silver wings pinned proudly to their jackets. They were greeted with standing ovations. The medal bore their likeness, engraved beside a soaring B-17, a symbol of all they had achieved. President Barack Obama praised them as trailblazers who opened doors for generations of women who would follow. Some wept quietly as the applause filled the chamber. After 65 years, their country had finally said thank you. The medal now rests in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, alongside their flight suits and logbooks. It is more than medal, it is memory. It tells every visitor that courage takes many forms, and that service is not defined by gender. When asked what the medal meant to her, Bernice Behadew said, "It means we mattered." Today, only a few of the original WASPs remain alive, but their legacy is everywhere. Every woman who flies a jet or commands a crew owes something to them. At the Air Force Academy, cadets pass by a permanent display honoring the WASPs, a silent reminder that courage doesn't always wear combat ribbons. NASA's first female astronauts credited them as pioneers. Eileen Collins, the first woman to command a space shuttle, said before her flight, "Every time I go up, I think of the WASPs who proved it could be done." At Avenger Field, the old airstrip is now the National WASP World War II Museum. Inside are uniforms, photos, and letters home. Every Memorial Day, visitors gather to read aloud the names of all 1,074 women who served. As the list ends, a vintage aircraft flies overhead and releases a single white rose, drifting down over the Texas plains where the first women once took off into history. Their story is no longer forgotten. It is now part of the fabric of America's past, a story of skill, sacrifice, and quiet heroism. They showed a nation that patriotism has no gender, that courage is not born of power, but of purpose. They didn't just help win a war. They helped redefine what was possible. When American pilots take to the skies today, they follow invisible trails left behind by those women, the ones who flew when few believed they could. They are remembered not for their struggle, but for their service, not for their novelty, but for their necessity. And though time has carried them beyond the clouds, their wings will never rest. They were, and always will be, the the Women Airforce Service Pilots. The first women to fly for America.